Warning, this is not entertainment.
You talk like a madman.
But I live like a sailor.
What you don't understand is that it's better to die on your feet than to live on your knees.
You have it backwards. It's better to live on your feet than to die on your knees.
I don't have to tell you things are bad. Everybody knows things are bad. The dollar buys a nickel's worth. Banks are going bust. Shopkeepers keep a gun under the counter. The air is unfit to breathe. Our food is unfit to eat. It's like everything everywhere is going crazy, so we don't go out anymore. We sit in the house, and slowly the world we're living in is getting smaller, and all we say is, please, at least leave us alone in our living room. Let me have my toaster and my TV and my steel-belted radios, and I won't say anything. Just leave us alone. Well, I'm not going to leave you alone.
If the doors of perception were cleansed, everything would appear to man as it is, infinite. For man has closed himself up till he sees all things through narrow chinks of his cavern.
Hello and welcome to Eschaton 2.0. As you can tell, the intro music is different and a lot of things are going to be changing with the podcast. So I wanted to just take a few minutes here, I'll be pretty brief, to talk to longtime listeners about what to expect going forward. As you know, I took somewhat of a semi-hiatus over the last year and a half where I haven't put out nearly as many podcasts as we did earlier on. Some of that was intentional, some of it not so much. Life just happened between moving to a new state, getting up and running with a farm, which has occupied a lot of my time, and then still having a day job. It's been a lot, but I also stepped away from the podcast I mentioned last year because I think I was kind of having a crisis of purpose with the podcast. And that's my own fault. It's all self-inflicted. And I wanted to report good news, which is that we're going to try to get back to our North Star when we set out on this podcast. And I know I've alienated some of you over the last few years by broadening the scope of this podcast to include topics that I never really intended to cover at the onset. But as I've grown and experienced new things in life, I brought those things to this audience, kind of just as a natural byproduct. So I know some of us have grown together in that regard, and you might like some of the things that we branched into. Others, I know for a fact, did not. And, we grew pretty rapidly for about a year and a half, 2 years, getting tons of new listeners all the time. And then it started to plateau. And then we actually lost a bunch of people. And that all coincided directly with the broadening of topics that we covered, as well as, I think, me introducing and interjecting too much of myself into the podcast, which is another thing that is going to be changing. And, some of that, I think, was just me in a misguided way, trying to be vulnerable and have enough personality in the show to make it worth listening to. But some of it was definitely hubris and pride as well, which is something I've struggled with most of my life, just like many of you. So I hope you can sympathize with that, and also, forgive me for that, because being blinded by my own pride and self-perception, I didn't realize at all times how much of my own personal self I was interjecting into these podcasts that were supposed to be kind of individual agnostic and really just presenting you content and material that you could do what you want with. But as I've pondered it and gone back and listened to it, I realized that I have interjected myself too much into some of the things, and it's taken away from the message of the content. So I hope if you've been able to get through that to this point, God bless you. But I hope you'll find it a positive change as I try to interject myself less and just get back to making content. So I'm going to get away from personal anecdotes and stories and putting stuff like that into the podcast, at least not nearly as much. I don't want it to become too dry and stale. So, I hope I can find the balance, but just want you to know that I know, and I'm aware of some of the concerns and complaints that folks have had with this podcast, and just want to get back to a place that we set out to move toward at the beginning, and hopefully we can grow the audience numbers back up and get there. At the same time, we brought in a bunch of new people that replaced people that we lost, that may have a different perspective and kind of watched and evolved with Eschaton over the last couple or few years. And I appreciate you, and I don't want to lose those listeners either, but I hope that you'll understand that what I wanted to do with this podcast at the beginning was to go on a journey of ideas and understanding of big picture questions in the world around us, not get lost in the minutia of current politics and the noise in our modern world, and some of the things I went down rabbit holes on, whether it be psychedelics or monetary policy, things like that do interest me and will always interest me, but probably didn't have a place in this forum, in this podcast. Even the farm and the homesteading thing, I mean, didn't really fit with this podcast, but it interested me at the time, and I thought it had some substantive value, so I shared it. We're going to get away from all that. The podcast is going to go back to its original intent. We started out talking about things like Isaac Newton and the end of the age, Colder War and the age that we currently find ourselves in, and whether or not it's a true sign of the end of our civilization. Are we at peak civilization? We talked about creation myths. We talked about comparative religion, gods of ancient Mesopotamia and the Near East as compared to the God of the Bible. All that stuff was front and center for a period. It's going to be front and center again. We're going to get back to it. I'm excited actually just talking about it now because I've got a backlog of things in that true to the spirit of the show genre, that I'm working on. So I hope, again, that if you kind of have stepped away from the podcast, but you're hearing this, that this will pique your interest and that we can get you back as a regular listener. Also going forward, I'm not going to be, so spread out about the way I'm trying to promote the show, because I'm terrible at that, as you guys know. The best way any podcast grows is organically through word of mouth. So I can't stress it enough, but please, if you haven't, if you've been listening for some time, and if you like the podcast, please leave us a review on Apple Podcasts. It takes like 2 minutes in your app on your phone, not even, to write a review. But if you could leave us a 4 or 5 star review, preferably a 5-star review, it really does help get the word out and get more people exposed to it. Also, terrible at getting engagement on social media. I'm giving up posting the podcast on Facebook because it's just not a conducive platform for that. But I did way back in 2017 when we started the podcast. I set up a Facebook page and a Facebook group, which I'm not active in hardly at all. So I'm going to let that kind of just exist. I'm going to leave it out there. I won't do anything with it. And if it continues on, great. But otherwise, if people don't want to engage there, completely understand. What I am going to do is try, quote unquote, knock on wood, try to get a Twitter presence going for the podcast. I set it up years ago, but then never used it. And the reason I want to do that is because Twitter has kind of evolved in the last few years, for better or for worse, and mostly for worse, it seems, to become sort of the global public square. And I think that's the best way to engage on an ideas level with people, as opposed to Facebook or Instagram, where it's more personal content and pictures and stuff. So all that to say, I am going to try. I think we have like 20 followers, maybe 15 followers on Twitter, because I literally never post. But that's going to change now. So please follow us on Twitter as Eschaton. You could find it as Joshua L. Wisely. Just search my name or Eschaton and my name, and you'll see the podcast come up. And hopefully we can grow that up a little bit and use that to grow the audience and have some intelligent discourse. But much better avenue, I think, than Instagram or Facebook, which we've tried both in the last couple of years. Well, last few years. Additionally, we will keep the Patreon page. I know I encouraged people last year when I knew I was going to be stepping away from the podcast as I went through a major life transition. I encourage people to stop donating and funding the podcast, and I also just stopped charging people through Patreon, because I didn't want to, be collecting money for you for a podcast I wasn't putting time into at the current time. Well, now that we're going to be getting back to our roots and trying to grow this podcast to be what it was intended to be 5 years ago, I would really appreciate it if you could support the podcast. Obviously, no pressure. I do not need any sort of financial support. That's not what this is about. Any dollar that goes to this podcast will just go back into making the podcast better and nowhere else. So if you want to do that, you feel inclined or led to do that, or if you've supported us before and then stopped when I told people to stop supporting, please consider rejoining us. You can do that on the website, joshwisely.com/donate. There's a link there to support either one-time or recurring through PayPal or through Patreon, or you can just find us on Patreon as Eschaton Podcast and support there. Those are the only things I will link to in show notes, but I will link to them consistently. I will link to the website, joshwisely.com, which is where you'll find our entire backlog of episodes, as well as a link to recommend people for me to interview on the podcast, or to invite me if you'd like me to speak virtually or in person to anything you might have going on. However, opportunities to do that are probably going to be limited, especially in the post-COVID world. So I understand. But if you would like to support the podcast, please do, either by going to our website, going to Patreon, or following us on Twitter and leaving us a review on your podcasting platform. That's pretty much it in terms of where things stand right now. But I wanted to let you know that I have not gone away. I just needed kind of a reset and to step back and see the 30,000 foot view of where this podcast has gone and whether or not I was satisfied with it. And to be honest, I wasn't. And it was self-inflicted. This podcast was on a trajectory where we had a lane. And when we stayed in that lane, we were growing and doing really well. But myself, like a dog chasing a flock of birds, just got distracted by so many different things. And when you go wide like that, you can't go deep. And if this podcast is anything, it's going to be one that goes deeper, as opposed to just going wide. So going forward, that will be the intention. It does take time and effort to obviously do the reading and the research to make those podcasts that can go deeper, but I am committed to doing so now that I'm settled and in a different phase of life where I have the capacity to do it. I am going to give it my best go. And if it fails, and if the podcast is just, dying a slow terminal death, then maybe it'll just die out, but I'm going to give it my best effort. I don't feel like I'd been doing that over the last few years. And let's see where this thing can go in this new and improved version of Eschaton. So as always, if you have questions, comments, thoughts, if you hate it and you think I should just, scrap the whole thing and start over, feel free to say that too. Won't change anything in the immediate term because I want to see what we can do here, but you can reach me anytime, josh@joshuawisely.com. Again, that's josh@joshwisley.com. Again, that's josh@joshuawisely.com. The link to the spelling, if you're not familiar, is in the show notes. But I look to engaging with you guys on a deeper level, actually getting back into some sort of a routine and cadence and giving you the content that you signed up for way back when we started this podcast. And there'll be less personal distraction and tangents and subjects that probably shouldn't be covered on this podcast. Those things have a place and a time, but this probably isn't the forum for it. So I'll let others do it who will likely do it better, or maybe I'll start a side project eventually. But Eschaton is going to get back to being what I once envisioned Eschaton to be. So I hope you guys enjoy it, and you'll continue with me on this journey going forward. Thanks. Love you all.